Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Dustin Crummett, and I'm here to talk about his paper that he co-authored on Psychophysical Harmony. So you have a co-author. You want to tell us about yourself and your co-author first?
So my co-author is Brian Cutter, who's a professor at Notre Dame, which is where I got my PhD. I have myself just recently finished up a postdoc in Munich, and soon I'm going to be moving to Seattle and doing some teaching there.
This new paper, it's an argument from consciousness, but it's a little bit of different spin. You base it on psychophysical harmony. So why don't we start out by talking about what is psychophysical harmony?
So it's basically just the fact that there exists what seem like appropriate correlations between our conscious states and our physical states. So, something feels unpleasant, that gives you a reason not to do it again, and sure enough, you're disposed not to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
So your behavior, your the internal workings of your brain, etc., are in line with the reasons provided by your conscious experience. Or there is a person-shaped object in my visual field, and sure enough, I form the belief that there is a person in front of me. Well, that experience justified that belief.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might say make accurate reports about the things that I'm experiencing. I might say, there's a gray patch in my visual field, and sure enough, there is a gray patch in my visual field. So there's semantic correspondence between my beliefs and my reports on the one hand, and my conscious experiences on the other. So it's really a very intuitive idea once you see what it is, but it's hard to describe because it's such a fundamental aspect of our lives.
Okay, so why do you think psychophysical harmony provides strong evidence for theism?
Right. So one interesting thing to note is that there have actually been a number of atheist philosophers of mind who have made the same point. They've said, look, we don't know how to explain psychophysical harmony, and we'll talk in a minute about why that is. We don't have any very convincing explanation of psychophysical harmony. Of course, if you were a theist, you would. But then they say, of course, theism is false for other reasons. So let's move on and try to, so we're not the only ones who have observed this. It's just that we're the only ones who turn it into an argument as opposed to sort of an offhand.
Okay.
Right. The rough idea, so it will be easiest to see what the problem is if we make two assumptions. One is dualism.
Okay.
So dualism here is the idea that the mental and the physical are distinct, and they're both co-fundamental. So it's not idealism. It's not that the physical reduces to the mental, nor is it
the mental. Yeah, right.
If you're a dualist, generally you're going to think the psychophysical correlations we observe could have been different, right? It's almost like the conscious experiences are sort of paint on the physical world, but it could have all been painted a different color, right?
Sure.
We could have not had any conscious experiences. We could have had pleasure and pain inverted, so we have pain in the same situations where we have pleasure now, and vice versa. We could have only been conscious in odd-numbered years. All of these things are metaphysically possible, right? And the other assumption we're going to make is causal completeness. So the idea that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause. This is an idea that many naturalists are attracted to. If you accept both of those, you might be what's called an epiphenomenalist dualist. So you might think, and this is a view that's been defended by people like David Chalmers and so on, Frank Jackson, though he later changed his mind. You might think, look, dualism is true. Our conscious states are non-physical, but they don't affect physical reality. They don't cause anything to happen in your brain. Your brain states are just caused by, prior brain states and inputs into your brain and so on. Your behavior has purely physical causes, right?
Okay.
So you have non-physical conscious states, but they're causally inert. And if we make those two assumptions, then it's easy to see why psychophysical harmony is going to be a problem. Because, well, look, the psychophysical correlations could have been very different, but physically everything would have played out the same. because they're not affecting the physical world. So if pleasure and pain were inverted, well, then I would pursue the painful experiences, just like I currently pursue pleasurable experiences. If my color phenomenology were replaced with the experience of tepid bath water, I would still say there's a gray patch in my visual field. I would make the same judgments, the same reports, do the same things. And so then we notice when you think about all the things that have to be right for psychophysical harmony to exist, all the correlations have to be just so. It looks like only a tiny fraction of the possibility space is occupied by harmonious correlations, as opposed to disharmonious ones.
Right. Okay.
And so it looks like if you're some sort of naturalist, there's not any reason going in, at least assuming dualism and epiphenomenalism, to expect the harmonious correlation patterns to be more likely. So it looks like, wow, it's a miracle almost, right? That we wound up with one of the small set of harmonious patterns rather than the much larger set of disharmonious patterns.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you're a theist, you can see, well, it looks like psychophysical harmony is responsible for a lot of important values, for our agency to be meaningful. The mere existence of consciousness is valuable in a lot of ways, for us to have accurate beliefs about what we're doing, our reasons for doing it, etc. And so theism has a bias in favor of the harmonious correlations. So harmony looks much more likely on theism than it does on at least sort of standard naturalistic atheism. And so if you think about it in Bayesian terms, it's very good evidence for theism. One thing I should talk about is the fact that these two assumptions I made are dispensable.
So the two assumptions...
Dualism and causal completeness.
Right. Dualism and causal completeness. They're not essential to this argument.
Right. So they're useful for a first pass to get the sense of what the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we see what the problem is, we realize adopting alternatives doesn't actually solve the problem. So suppose you're an interactionist dualist, for instance. So you accept dualism, but you think your mental states do cause behavior.
Right.
Somehow they can interrupt the natural chain of causes. Well, okay. But it looks like there's no reason to think that they're having the actual physical effects they have is essential to them. It seems like pain could have had the causal profile of pleasure, or vice versa.
Okay.
Right? So as an interactionist dualist, you're committed to thinking your mental states have some sort of effect in the natural world, presumably by causing certain neurons to fire or something like that.
Okay.
But it doesn't seem like it's metaphysically impossible for the same states to have caused different neurons to fire. Mm-hmm. Right? It would have just been a different natural law, so to speak, resulting in different causal effects. And in that case, it doesn't look like interaction itself is going to bias us towards harmony, because interaction will only produce harmony if the mental states have the right causal effects. So what it does is sort of push the harmony problem back a step to the question of almost the fine-tuning of the causal laws governing mental and physical interaction. Or maybe the most interesting one to talk about is physicalism. Suppose you're a physicalist, you think, no, there's nothing non-physical going on here. We're just physical objects, and mental states are physical states of some sort, are grounded in them or whatever. And there we say, and this is maybe sort of the hardest bit of the argument, but there we say, look, there are two kinds of physicalism. We might call them a priori and a posteriori physicalism. So a priori physicalists will say there's like a conceptual connection between the physical and the mental.
Mm-hmm.
So these scenarios I've been describing where pleasure and pain are inverted, that's actually incoherent. There's some sort of conceptual problem with it. You can see a priori that anyone who's disposed to aversive behavior in the right way is in pain, or whatever you say, right? And that just seems false, that view. And most physicalists agree that view seems false, because the things I've been describing do seem conceivable. So most physicalists will say, no, it's not a priori, it's a posteriori. Your physical states or your mental states just are physical states, but that's an identification we make based on empirical observation. Mm-hmm. Just like you can identify water and H2O on the basis of empirical observation. Yeah. Even though there's no conceptual connection. We couldn't just by thinking about it tell that water is H2O, right? So the thing to note is a posteriori physicalism leaves open as epistemic possibilities all of the possibilities that the dualist believes in. Well, yeah, so at least very many of them. I mean, there are technicalities there, but those are all epistemic probabilities going in. And what that means is that a posteriori physicalism itself doesn't actually predict harmony. If all you know is that a posteriori physicalism is true, then you should think, well, okay, there are a large number of possible correlation patterns. In fact, not merely correlation, but identity patterns or grounding patterns. But I don't really have much reason to favor some of those over the others. I don't have any reason to think going in that they're going to be harmonious. And so it doesn't actually predict harmony, whereas the theistic design hypothesis does predict harmony. You could sort of narrow the physicalist hypothesis. No, I'm not just saying whatever the correlations are, they turn out to be necessary identities. What I'm saying is that the actual correlations that we've observed are necessary identities. And then it does predict harmony, of course, right? Because harmony actually exists. But you've done that by, essentially, you've gained predictive power at the cost of prior probability. Because this was just one very improbable version of physicalism. Post hoc, you say, that's the right one.
I see.
But of course, going in, it was very unlikely to be the right one. And so when we put it in Bayesian terms, it gets predictive power at the expense of sort of starting further behind.
Yeah.
Whereas we want to claim theism gets the predictive power without a big hit to prior probability because, it's sort of built into theism that God is going to be disposed to produce these valuable states.
Yeah.
Now, you might think, well, but if physicalism is true, God couldn't change the psychophysical correlations. And if that's right, if harmony is very good evidence for design, and design requires the falsity of physicalism, it may be that psychophysical harmony is evidence for the falsity of physicalism in favor of dualism or idealism or some other. But we didn't need to assume at the outset that physicalism was false. That's something that has fallen out of the consideration of harmony. That makes sense.
This has parallels to the fine-tuning argument. But traditionally, when a fine-tuning argument's made, a quick objection is the multiverse.
Right.
So what does that objection apply here?
I don't think it does. And here's why. So the multiverse objection says, well, look, maybe there are just a vast number of universes, and they're all a little bit different. The constants and the laws are a little bit different in each one. Just statistically, some of them are going to be life-permitting. And of course, we find ourselves in one of the life-permitting ones. Where else are we going to find ourselves? We're alive. And so there's nothing unusual, once we keep all that in mind, about the fact that we're in a life-permitting universe. And of course, defenders of the fine-tuning argument, have various responses to that. But it looks like that sort of reply is not even going to get off the ground when it comes to the question of psychophysical fine-tuning. Reason being that there's not the same kind of observer selection effect. You say, well, of course we're in one of the life-permitting universes. But, suppose that there's a vast array of universes with different psychophysical laws. Well, we didn't have to be in a harmonious universe. There are observers in all these disharmonious universes. They just are in a very disharmonious state, right?
Yeah.
So we could have been in one of those. Why is it that we're in the harmonious one instead? And so the fact that we find ourselves in this harmonious universe when, if it were merely, our position were merely the result of, random chance playing out across the multiverse, we would expect ourselves instead to find ourselves in one of the much greater number of disharmonious universes. It seems like it's evidence against that hypothesis. It might still be that we're in a multiverse, but if we are, it looks like the multiverse somehow has to be biased towards producing psychophysical harmony, and that itself would be evidence.
Right. We've just really been contrasting this evidence on theism and this evidence on some sort of naturalistic atheism. But are there other alternatives that this evidence, psychophysical harmony, would favor?
Yeah, I think there are. Any body of evidence is going to be equally good evidence for a wide range of hypotheses. This is called the underdetermination thesis in philosophy of science. And so you'll have to make the determination between these different theories on the basis of some other reason, maybe simplicity or theoretical virtues, right? Fit with background knowledge. So yeah, we agree. You might also take it as evidence for, say, axiarchism, which is the view that the world exists because it's valuable. So,
that's John Leslie's proposal, right?
Of course, it might be that axiarchism entails theism because, well, then why shouldn't God exist? Because he'd be the most valuable thing, right? Or it might be Paul Draper defends what he calls aesthetic deism. Aesthetic deism. So maybe there's a designer, but he's not morally good. He just wants the world to be aesthetically interesting, have some drama in it and some pretty stuff. Well, maybe psychophysical harmony contributes to that too. It would be a very bad story if the characters were all just like have this crazy nonsense going on in their minds. So maybe it's evidence for that too, and we have to make the decision between aesthetic deism and traditional theism on the basis of some other consideration, right? Some other argument or considerations about again, theoretical virtues and that sort of stuff. So yeah, we agree that there might be other views that can explain the evidence, but sort of at least the main naturalistic competitor looks like it does a very poor job in explaining the evidence, we think.
What advantages do you think this argument has over more traditional arguments from consciousness?
To some extent, it's compatible with them. So some arguments from consciousness say just appeal to the fact that consciousness exists. Oh, it didn't have to. It exists. It's this interesting and valuable thing. God might be interested in it, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, that's compatible with our argument, right? It might be that consciousness existing at all is some evidence for theism, and then it existing in the harmonious way is more. But we can do without the assumptions that are made in some arguments from consciousness. So, for instance, many versions of the argument assume some form of dualism. They first try to argue for dualism and then argue that the existence of consciousness provides evidence for theism. And as I say, we think that we can go without having to establish dualism on independent grounds. It might be that we start out assigning some chance of physicalism being true, or it might be that idealism is true, or certain sorts of panpsychism are true, and harmony, the argument would still go through. Or Richard Swinburne, his version of the argument takes as its datum the fact that there are very many very complicated psychophysical correlations. Think about all the different experiences you have and how complicated the different brain states are that generate them. So he thinks it would be intrinsically very improbable that the state of affairs would exist on its own, and that makes it a good candidate for being explained by design. We can do without it's hard to know exactly how complicated the fundamental psychophysical laws are. We don't really know exactly what they look like. You might think, okay, there's some reasons to think they're going to be really complicated, but we don't really need that assumption. Even if they're very simple and elegant and natural, the fact that they're harmonious is still significant. So I think, to some extent it's compatible with some of the other arguments, but we also want to say there are some assumptions that are quite controversial that are made in some arguments that we can do without.
Yeah. Well, this was fascinating, and so thanks for watching. Thank you for doing this. I really enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.